Professor Wolterstorff, welcome back to Yale. If I may, I'll call you Nick.
Absolutely, yes, thanks, yes.
Because you're my colleague at,
Right.
at the Divinity School.
Right.
It's great to have you back, and it's
Thank
great
you.
to have you back to discuss with us this the issue of the role of faith in liberal democracies. Now, you've written on that topic, and your account is not quite the standard one, as one finds it in many of the classical textbooks and
Right.
in great works of folks like John Rawls. Can you say a bit of why you demur from those views, classical ones?
Sure, I suppose I should first explain the sort of rationale of those traditional views, right?
Yes.
So I suppose the idea, let me start a little bit differently. It's my impression that a lot of lay people in Europe, I know Holland, the Netherlands best, a lot of lay people in Europe are very hostile to the use of religious arguments in public affairs. I think that's much less true in the U.S. I mean, in fact, one hears religious arguments all the time, and usually they're not shouted down because they're illicit or something like that. So in this country, it has mainly been the theorists, political philosophers, and so forth, who've argued the case. And the case goes, I take it, something like this. John Rawls is the one who really inspired the debate in 1993 with a book of his, Political Liberalism. And Rawls's idea was this, that one of the core principles of a liberal democracy is that all the citizens are to treat each other as free and equal. That's just sort of rock bottom for him. There are some other principles, but that's, for Rawls, I suspect, the deepest principle. And his thought then was that an implication of that is that when we give each other one more preliminary matter. Almost all legislation is coercive in some way or another. If there's no other coercion involved, there's a coercion of supporting it with taxation. Very, very little legislation is just because it's nice or something like that. I mean, some monument in the public square or something like that, but most legislation is coercive. So Rawls's root thought was that if I'm going to support a piece of coercive legislation, then I should offer you reasons, and the reasons I have for it should be reasons that you also accept. Because if I support it for my reasons, and those are reasons that you do not accept and you're opposed to it, and I go ahead and support it and even vote for it, I am not treating you as free and equal. I'm viewing my position on this as more important and fundamental than yours. But we're supposed to treat each other as free and equal. So the two other parts of the Rawlsian position are that in our religiously pluralistic society, religious reasons, just in the nature of the case, are not ones shared by our fellow citizens, so just by the very nature of the pluralism. So they're disqualified on that ground. What's left then as reasons that we can expect each other all to agree to? Rawls's view was that just the very idea of a liberal democracy incorporates certain principles, among them this free and equal principle. So and he called those principles incorporated in liberal democracy public reason. So you get the Rawls conclusion that we should appeal to, when we're debating important matters of public policy, to public reason. Good friend of mine, Robert Audi, has basically the same position, but he thinks that he calls it what we should appeal to, secular morality. But one way or the other, secular morality or these public reasons, that's what we should appeal to, because we can expect our fellow citizens to share those. We cannot expect them to share our religious reasons.
So as good philosopher, you have made plausible the arguments of your opponent. Now, why do you disagree?
For several reasons. One is there's I'll start with the philosopher sort of reason and then get to the more practical ones. When you think about it, there's a deep paradox in this position. And the paradox is revealed like this. So, you want to follow the Rawlsian-Audian principle, offering reasons to your fellow citizens that you expect them to accept. Now, for most of one's fellow citizens, we don't have any idea whatsoever as to what reasons they accept. We don't know them. We know only a few people. And among the people that we do know, we know that some of them are ill-informed, boneheaded, stubborn in their views, and so forth. So everybody who holds this position sees that you got to put some kind of qualifiers on this. You can't, or we'd be stymied. I mean, we'd never be in favor of any legislation. So they all go off into some idealizing conditions like this. Offer reasons that you can expect that all your fellow citizens, if they were fully rational, if they were fully informed, and if they were flexible in their opinions, would accept. Now, whatever you, I mean, it's one question as to whether there is any answer to that. But now reflect on it. So if you think that they are reasons that they would accept if they were fully rational and so forth, if you now go ahead and pass this legislation, you are in fact coercing these actual people. You wouldn't be coercing these idealized people, right? But you're coercing these actual people. So that's a paradox. I think a more important point, Miroslav, is this. The picture is then that in Audi's case, there is this secular morality that we can all appeal to. In Rawls, that there are principles embedded in the idea of liberal democracy. Now here's what I think is a really interesting book by Robert Jones on he calls it Liberalism's Troubled Search for Equality. It's on the debate which preceded the passage in Oregon in favor, just barely passed, of physician-assisted suicide. And what's really interesting in this book is that he quotes is that the debate was in good measure written out. I mean, it was highly articulate, not just sound bites. And what turns up is that there isn't any such thing as secular morality. There are secular moralities. Some of these people were utilitarians in how they thought about the issue. Some of them were, in effect, Ayn Rand egoists and how they thought about the position. Some were sort of romantic expressivists, giving expression to your true self and so forth. So a bunch of secular moralities and a whole variety of religious moralities. Some natural law theorists, some turned more in sort of Protestant divine command theory. And nobody's saying anything so flat-footed as, God told me physician-assisted suicide was wrong, so I'm against it. So there isn't any such thing as a shared morality.
So that's against Audi's position in a sense, right? And how about public reason? Whatever your convictions are, when you enter into the public domain, you should give reasons that are acceptable or have potential of being acceptable to everyone.
So it turns out that there aren't enough such reasons, maybe on a few issues, but on this issue of physician-assisted suicide, you're not going to get from the idea of liberal democracy to any particular position on that. So, I mean, if I thought there was such a thing as a thick enough public morality, or if I thought there was such a thing as a shared secular morality, I suppose what I'd say is use it whenever possible, but there isn't any such thing.
But your sense is also not just that there isn't such a thing, right, as something shared. Your sense is also that a religious person ought to somehow have a right to express their views, rights of expression, freedom of expression, and also to advocate and be a religious person in his or her own way.
So that's my third basic position. There are a lot of religious people, there are quite a few religious people who are willing to go down Audi's line, I suppose, of thinking in terms of secular morality, and then their religion is some kind of addition to that. But a lot of religious people, as we both know, as anybody knows, think about these basic political issues in religious terms. And some of them, a lot of them, probably find themselves unable to think about these issues in any other terms. Those just are the terms Oh, they hear somebody else talking about them in national interest terms maybe, or purely economistic terms, but that just feels profoundly wrong to them. So in a liberal democracy, one of the basic planks is that everybody has the right to exercise their religion as they see fit. And so it seems to me that to silence such people, to silence those reasons, is a violation of one of the fundamental, of the opening commitment of the U.S. Bill of Rights to freedom of religious exercise.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And do you think also that there is a kind of social value to allowing people to express their public views, to air them in the very act of expressing them in the public setting? They'll reflect also on them and how they're received by others. It will give opportunity to larger public to examine those arguments, to practice something like immanent criticism, to kind of deconstruct them from within, and they will either strengthen them or weaken them. A debate then starts going on.
Yeah. So I think two things happen then when we allow people to, provided they do it in the right way, when we allow them to offer whatever arguments seem to them relevant and cogent and so forth. One is that what I've experienced is this, that when I listen, for example, to a Jewish person's take on some political issue, often I feel that I've learned something of great importance that would not have occurred to me all by myself, and would certainly would not even have been voiced if I'd said to this person, hey, look, you got to use neutral arguments. I don't want to hear any of your Jewish arguments. And something mysterious takes place there, which I can only describe as you make allowance for. Martin Luther King's speeches were typically very Christian, but lots of people were inspired by them without converting to Christianity, and they made allowance. They learned something of great importance. They said, well, I would have said it differently, but I hadn't thought of it. So if we muffle all the distinct takes on important moral and political issues, I think we've seriously impoverished myself. That's my experience. I've learned from reading Jewish commentators especially on, and others as well, but especially Jewish. And the other point that you hint at, allowing these other voices into the public debate, maybe forces is too strong. Well, forces them also to not just shout, but to think through their position with greater care, to work it out, to articulate it. That's what was interesting once again about the Oregon debate. There was a process, and the first statements of the arguments were pretty primitive, but everybody forced everybody to state their position more articulately, and so there was a great gain in public insight as to what the real issues were.
That's very interesting. So if I heard you rightly, you in disagreeing with a position like Rawls's, you said, well, there isn't such a thing really as the public reason. Two, you said, well, even if there were, religious folks whose lives are shaped by their religious convictions ought to have right to express their views. And third is that public in general, in each position in particular,
the third is a sort of public good argument rather than a rights argument.
Being impoverished, and so there's a public good kind of an argument. Do you think that? So I'm persuaded you're not surprised, right? But do you think that applies to democracies only at a certain level of development, at a certain level of identification with the democratic process itself? What conditions, in terms of how democracies are understood, how they are embraced, need to be satisfied, if any, for a position like yours to make sense? Obviously, the response to your position might be, well, if you let all these religious people speak their mind, we're going to have cacophony, and worse than cacophony, we're going to have clashes. We're going to back into kind of religious wars, kind of the specter of religious wars is then invoked.
Yep.
I take you to disagree with that, but can you talk about a bit about conditions that need to be satisfied for this to be a fruitful process?
Right. So I think democracy is a much richer concept than just voting. I fear U.S. foreign policy often thinks if you can get them to vote, then they've been democratized. So I'll put it like this. A curious feature of the Rawls-Audi position is that they talk very little about votes. And when you think about it, you can sort of see why that is. The goal is consensus, because only consensus would legitimate liberal democracy. Absence of consensus means somebody is coerced, and that for them means that somebody is not being treated as free and equal. I, on the contrary, think that a fair vote is of the essence of democracy. We never get consensus. And this speaks to your question, and then what's essential to the existence and the endurance of democracy is that the losers are willing to live with losing the vote. They don't try to, they're not deeply angry, they don't try to upset the process because they lost and so forth, but they're willing to live with the vote, presumably on the assumption that they aren't going to lose every vote. So tolerance, in that very specific sense, tolerating the presence of the other and saying, okay, we lost the vote, we're still going to work together, and we're jointly going to defend and preserve this liberal democracy, I think is at the very heart of it. Now, it has to be preceded, that vote, in my view, by lots of dialogue, which is fair and not abusive insofar as we can make it non-abusive and so forth. But when I watch Iraq from a distance, it looks to me as if it's constantly teetering on the edge of the losers not willing to live with losing the vote. Constant threats being made. Well, if that happens, we won't share in the oil, or we're going to pull out. We Kurds are going to pull out, or something like that. And that's the deepest menace to a democracy.
So did I hear rightly that there has to be in a general public a kind of sense that we have a stake in this democratic process as democratic process, whether we are winning or losing any given battle,
right.
so to speak. So certain identification with democratic ideals and democratic practices. So if you have a deeply divided polity on religious matters, would you still be able to have the kind of robust public voice that you are advocating, admittedly for a very different situation, namely for liberal democracy in the United States or in the Western countries more broadly?
Probably not. Probably not. I mean, part of the history, I take it, of how liberal democracy emerged in the West. Well, there's a document apparently by Philip de Mornay, in which he was a Protestant, but the document is anonymous, and he represents himself as Catholic in the document. And what he says is, it will take too much blood to continue the current policy. So this is not a rousing defense of liberal democracy. It's saying the alternative is we're endlessly slaughtering each other. So that's how let's face it, it didn't just emerge out of everybody's embracing of lofty ideals. Western Europeans began to say, what else?
So in a sense, what you're saying is not that liberal democracy isn't, that liberal democracy of the kind that you're describing isn't for those kinds of situations, but that they may have practical reasons, namely stopping the spillage of blood in order to embrace it.
Comes a certain point when they say this can't go on.
And one might argue that if religious voices are not allowed to be heard, the tendency might be to turn into politically aggressive fundamentalists, right?
That's right.
Who are undermining the democratic process as such.
Who are filled with resentment,
Yeah.
and a kind of rightful resentment
Yeah.
for being silenced, and that then is a deep sort of menace to the polity. Yeah.
To what degree do you think that the notion of liberal democracy and the particular version that you are advocating is a plant that not just has de facto grown on a broadly culturally understood Christian soil, but that it needs some such soil in order to thrive? Is it transportable to other religious climates?
I think we don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah.
I don't think I know I don't think any of us knows the answer to that question. Is there something peculiar to Christian, Judeo-Christian tradition? That's certainly where it originated, but I don't know the answer to that question. It's really, it's probably the most important question facing us in the world today. I mean, it's not clear to me that democracy cannot flourish in basically Islamic countries.
Mm-hmm. But in a sense, what you're saying, right, you're not saying, here's a kind of general theory of democracy dropped as if with the sky cook from above. You're saying, I, as a Christian philosopher, having grown in a particular situation, this is how I see it, and in a sense you're offering that to the wider world community. Would that be how you would put it?
Yes. So two things. I emphasize the fact that it did in fact emerge in a crisis situation where Europe was full of slaughter. But I do think that there's another crucial piece of it. U.S. liberal democracy, I suppose, is most philosophically articulate in the U.S. by virtue of how it began and the highly articulate founders and so forth. Liberal democracy here is a rights-based democracy, very clearly. And lots of good historians now have shown that the idea of natural rights becomes articulated among the 12th century canon lawyers in the West. A canon lawyer is somebody who's concerned with developing church law, but church law in the 12th century Western Europe, church law covered most laws. So it was canon law, yes, but it was law. And that's fascinating. So in the 12th century, these canon lawyers, basically lawyers, began talking about the rights of aliens, that is, the rights of people who are not members of your community, the rights of foreigners, the rights of the poor. Rights are all over the place. So I think the basic question is this. Suppose you have a culture which simply does not think in terms of rights, does not think in terms of violating somebody. That's a way of thinking that does not occur to them. And there are moral cultures in which rights just play no role. Would it be possible for liberal democracy to emerge in a culture where the idea of rights is just plain absent? When I first went to South Africa in '76, what bowled me over is that the Afrikaners refused to discuss the issue there in terms of justice, but said charity and benevolence were the issue. They recited individual acts of charity, and they said that the whole system of apartheid was a act of great social charity. There are these 11 or so different nationalities in South Africa, and the Afrikaners thought that what would be wonderful is that each of them would find its own identity, and you can't find your own identity if you're all mixed together. And so that they had to be separated, and hence it was an act of great charity on their part, benevolence, to institute apartheid. No talk about rights. How can you have liberal democracy if you're thinking along those lines? You might have a vote,
right.
but liberal democracy is just... So I'm thinking, Miroslav, that a culture in which the idea of every human being carrying certain rights that must not be violated, if that's missing, I'm not sure that a stable liberal democracy, you can have votes, but would you have a liberal democratic culture?
But invert that. If the culture of rights is present, significant preconditions for liberal democracy are given, right?
Yes.
Would that also what you would say?
Right. And there are Islamic scholars who contend that whatever be the case with lots of strands of Islam, Islam in fact has all the potentials for a highly articulate account of rights.
And as it turns out, language of rights, albeit differently understood, is almost the universal moral code these days. So in that sense, it's it looks like at least potential might be there from your perspective, right?
Yep.
You know what? I'm thinking what might need to happen to a religion, to a religious faith, so that it would have a stake in liberal democracy. How do you think about exclusivist religious claims in conjunction to what it seems to me like if you affirm liberal democracy, you've got to affirm something like a pluralism as a political project. Right?
Yeah.
How do you think of these? On the one hand, exclusivist religious claims. On the other hand, the need of these religions also to affirm pluralism as a project, political project.
So it seems to me a religious group can, and most of them do, say that our view of humanity's relation to God is the correct one. The other people have it in some way wrong. I mean, if you don't say that, then I guess you join the other ones, right? It's definitely possible to say that, and at the same time to say it's profoundly wrong for me to put those others under some sort of coercion or to give them second-class citizenship. If I think that they, as well as I, bear God's image and am loved by God, then no matter what religion they happen to hold, I as a religious person say to myself, there are lots of things I must never do to them, or I am violating them and God. And I think it's that religions have concentrated on their exclusiveness, as you call it, and have failed to fully be awake to the character of this other human being, whether or not they're outside of the religious group.
So a certain sense of religious transformation, in a sense, that needs to happen, that you think is authentically religious, right? So what I hear you saying is not religion needs to adjust itself to democratic demands. What I hear you saying is there are religious convictions that are so deeply profound, at least when it comes to Christian tradition, that cannot but make you into somebody interested in political pluralism.
That's my view. So instead of concentrating always on the exclusiveness and we got it right and they got it wrong and so forth, for everybody, at least in the Abrahamic religion, to keep in mind that human beings, one and all, are creatures beloved by God and created in the image of God. And that just means there are lots of things I may never do to them. So that's not right. So that's not giving in to some alien view. That's taking with total seriousness your own religious views. So I think when the Abrahamic religions at least recognize give full sway to their deepest convictions, they are led to be supporters of liberal democracy in most situations.
You know, I happen to believe that in the world today, interaction and relationship between democratic traditions and faith traditions are one of the great challenges of today in the context of globalization processes. And during these conversations, you have given us reason to hope that both democratic traditions can be faith-friendly and that faiths can be democracy friendly. Thank you very much for this
Thank you,
conversation.
Miroslav. Thank you.